Hello, History 1 students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have your notes for Chapter 16, Section 4, The War's Impact. And in 1919, the United States, obviously, we were out of the war. We've got a lot of soldiers coming home, a lot of parades. Matter of fact, the American Legion that we know today was created after World War I to kind of help support our veterans. Uh, Out of the 2 million men that were coming home, some of them were having a little struggle finding jobs. So that kind of sets the scene for what's going to be happening here. So, in number one, when controls were removed from the economy, people raced to buy goods that had been, for the most part, rationed during the war. While businesses rapidly raised prices, kept low during the war. And so, what we're facing is something called inflation. And as a result of that, our economy kind of was moving into a period of time that we would probably label as a recession. So workers wanted to raise their wages to keep up with inflation, but a lot of companies wanted to hold the wages down instead. And matter of fact, some of them even thought about cutting hours and such, and that's going to lead to some protest. So by the end of the war, workers were better organized and more capable of organizing like strikes than it had ever been before. Matter of fact, during the war, union membership had soared, and so now we have a lot of workers who are organized, who are, for the most part, ready to take on this whole idea of a strike. In 1919 alone, there were around 3,600 strikes with roughly 4 million people participating. And one of those strikes took place in the city of Seattle. It was actually what we would call a general strike. It had started when shipyard workers had basically protested and went on strike demanding higher wages and shorter hours. And what ends up happening is the rest of the community gets involved in supporting these workers. And so, roughly 60,000 people in Seattle at the height of this thing were striking in solidarity with our shipyard workers. What ends up happening is in the course of the strike, the fact that they pretty much shut down the city, um, the strike came to an end without a lot of gains for the workers. But this whole idea of a general strike really kind of caught on. And what's going to happen is you're going to see a general strike that's going to happen um, elsewhere down the line in history. When we get into the 1930s, you're going to hear about a general strike that happens in San Francisco, and other cities are going to adopt this kind of policy. Other strikes that were going on in 1919, one of the most famous ones, and number five here, took place in Boston when 75% of the police force actually walked off the job. And this led to riots and looting, pretty much total chaos. The governor of Massachusetts was a man named Calvin Coolidge, and he called out the National Guard. The police commissioner of Boston pretty much fired all the striking workers, all the police that had been on strike, and he hired a brand new police force. And as a result of this, Calvin Coolidge got a lot of support. And in 1920, he is going to be nominated as the vice presidential candidate for the Republican Party for what he did in the strike. Along with that, you're going to have U.S. Steel that's going to go on strike. They had roughly 350,000 workers that went on strike, and it was actually the largest strike in U.S. history as a result of that. And the president of U.S. Steel, he was upset with these workers. A lot of the workers were immigrants. He hired African Americans, what he called loyal Americans, and even Mexicans to replace these workers. And as a result of that, in the city of Gary, Indiana, which is kind of a suburb of Chicago, at a U.S. Steel plant, there was a riot, and 18 strikers actually died as a result of this. The deal is that strike pretty much collapsed in 1920 with not a lot of things happening. But this kind of leads to this unpleasant issue of racism here in our country. And in 1919, we're going to see a lot of race riots that are going to break out through the nation. Some of this has to do with the fact that, during the war, we had the great migration of African Americans to the north to take jobs in factories. And when the war ends and our soldiers are home, there's a lot of concern about jobs and wages and housing and things of that nature. And so violence breaks out. And the summer of 1919 has a nickname. It's kind of known as Red Summer because of all the blood that was spilled during these race riots. So after the war, returning soldiers blamed African Americans for taking their jobs. And in the summer of 1919, frustration and racism erupted in violence as 25 race riots broke out across the nation. You had race riots that were happening in Texas. There was a pretty bad race riot in Washington, D.C. that lasted about 4 days, and troops were called out to break that up. But probably the worst race riot that took place in the nation actually happened in Chicago. And the summer of 1919 was hot. You had a situation where some African Americans had gone down to Lake Michigan to a beach that was pretty much an all-white beach. And beachgoers were throwing rocks at the African Americans, and the African Americans were throwing rocks back. One of the young African Americans who was involved in this event was in a situation drowned as a result of these rocks being thrown back and forth. He never surfaced. Some assumed that he might have gotten hit by a rock. But as a result, a full-scale riot broke out. Angry African Americans attacked white neighborhoods. Angry blacks attacked, or angry whites attacked black neighborhoods. This went on for 2 weeks. Roughly 38 people were killed in these race riots. 500 people were injured. And these riots kind of like start triggering a lot of other riots. Omaha, Nebraska was not spared. It had a massive riot that led to a lynching of a black man right in front of the Douglas County Courthouse that you see pictured down below here. You had a major race riot that took place a couple of years later in Tulsa, Oklahoma, which literally, Tulsa, Oklahoma at that period of time had one of the most thriving African American communities. There was a lot of middle class African Americans, a lot of wealthy African Americans, and that neighborhood literally was decimated by these riots. And then you had the resurgence of the KKK. So a lot of bad things brewing, needless to say. But African Americans, as a result of these riots, started basically joining the NAACP, and its membership surged after the war. A lot of African Americans understood now the need to fight for their rights, particularly their voting rights. And one of the things that the NAACP is going to be promoting is an anti-lynching bill before Congress. It's going to take a little while to get that passed, but obviously, there was a need for that because there were incidences of lynching, not just isolated to the South, but throughout northern states as well. As strikes erupted across the United States in 1919, there was also other fears, and that is the fear of communists. Many believed that they might try to seize power in a nationwide panic known as the Red Scare. And maybe those fears were, maybe just. Russia was fighting a revolution at this period of time. And, for the most part, communism, socialism kind of had been kind of linked to things like labor strikes and things like that, and some of the violence that was happening with these riots that we had already talked about. So, there's some great concern here. In April of 1919, the U.S. Postal Service had actually intercepted more than 30 packages that were bombs. And many believe that they were linked back to some of these communist radicals. So for the most part, most Americans believed that some of these bombings of the spring of 1919 suggested a conspiracy to destroy the American way of life. And so now we're gonna want to start going after some of these folks just for the sake that we were concerned for our own safety. A man named A. Mitchell Palmer, who happened to be the Attorney General of the United States, he actually had been targeted by one of these bombs, but he established a special division within his Justice Department that became originally was known as the General Intelligence Division, but it became known as the Federal Bureau of Investigations, the FBI as we know it. And the FBI was going to go on a series of raids. So from late 1919 to the spring of 1920, the government carried out raids targeting immigrants and ignoring, in many cases, some of the civil rights of some of our suspects. I don't think that's popping up here. But the FBI, for the most part, these raids were known as the Palmer raids. There we go. And the Palmer raids, for the most part, targeted a lot of these communist sympathizers. In November of 1919, the Palmer raids basically went after the offices of the Union of Russian Workers in 12 cities around the United States. And within a few weeks, 249 immigrants from Russia were transported and deported back to Russia. New York State expelled 5 members of its state house because they were members of the Socialist Party. 32 states passed sedition laws making it illegal to join any kind of group that would be advocating revolution. So, for the most part, people were getting a little upset. We had economic problems, labor unrest, racial tensions that created a sense of disillusionment. And a lot of people were wanting some change. So in 1920, we had an election year. Woodrow Wilson had suffered a stroke, couldn't run for office again. And so James Cox and his vice presidential candidate, a man named Franklin Delano Roosevelt, were going to run as progressives for the Democratic Party in 1920. They were up against Warren G. Harding and Calvin Coolidge from the Republican Party. Harding was from the state of Ohio. He was wanting to go back to the way things once were, this normalcy. For the most part, Americans really wanted that. He won by a landslide as a result of this election. Thank you very much.